This morning, I want to continue a sermon conversation called Reluctance. We're looking at the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, and we've talked about the last couple of weeks. And we're looking at the book of Jonah, a well-known story in the scripture text, but we're looking at it through the lens of reluctance, because we could say a lot of things about Jonah, this interesting book, and the prophet that it's about in the Old Testament. But one of the things that comes to the fore again and again is his reluctance to follow God's call. And I want to start with just a governing question about the book itself. Gary and Kirsty Shriver, they're in our midst. They're brilliant people in our church, and they've got a podcast called How to Love Lit. And they take a book and they exegete it, and they tell us more about some famous classic books out there, like Fahrenheit 451. And something that Kirsty says again and again is, the author tells you a lot about the story in the first few lines. And she says that again and again in their podcast. And the writer of Jonah does a similar thing. So in the first few verses, the writer talks about a prophet named Jonah, where he's from, and two cities. One city that he's called to, which is Nineveh, and the city that he tries to go to first, which is Tarshish. Now, last week, Greg Ott talked about Tarshish, and he talked about Nineveh and their relationship and their distance from Jerusalem. And so in order for us to make sense of this book at all, we have to ascribe value to these two places, because these are two geographic markings in the book of Jonah. And so many different scholars over the years, they began to make some assumptions about what Nineveh meant and what Tarshish meant for those who first heard this story. And they try to lay that into their story so that we can get a truth from Jonah's story. I was taking a look at a book by Eugene Peterson, who wrote the Message paraphrase of the Old New Testaments. He was a preacher himself. He's got this great book over the book of Jonah called Life Under the Unpredictable Plant. And he takes a look at the book of Jonah, and he actually ascribes a bit of value to what Tarshish meant to Jonah and what Nineveh meant to Jonah, and the reluctance for Jonah not to go to Nineveh because of what it meant for him to go there, and why there was this compelling temptation to go to Tarshish. And so I want to make a point about reluctance, because we're talking about reluctance over the course of this book. Reluctance isn't just the hesitancy to move or to make a move. Reluctance isn't just standing still, being under a paralysis by analysis. Sometimes reluctance has an interesting shape where instead of just doing nothing with reluctance, we get busy doing other things so that we don't have to do the thing that we know that we're called to. Maybe you're married to a person like this, but they have a household chore they must get to. Like the gutters are down and it's raining in Memphis. So we need to address the gutters today. But because they don't want to, they do 10 other things around the house to keep them from that. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Is that your spouse? Yes. Would you be so bold to raise your hand and acknowledge that? But sometimes this is reluctance. Reluctance is not standing still and doing nothing, but it's hiding behind a cloud of activity so that I don't have to do the thing that I know that I'm called to do. Doing many good things so that we can argue and say, what are you talking about? I'm doing all these great things. My schedule is full of so many good things out there. How can you accuse me of not doing this thing? I've got all this other stuff going on. This is what Eugene Peterson says. Jonah wasn't going to stay in Jerusalem. He knew that he had to go somewhere. But when he went down to Joppa to buy his fare to get on a ship to either go to Nineveh or somewhere else, perhaps he was scanning, give me some license here, all the pamphlets of all the places where he could go. He had the means. He was an affluent person. He could buy fare onto a ship to go anywhere. And Tarshish is 2,500 miles away, and so he had means to get that far. And so perhaps when he was scanning all the pamphlets, he looked at the one to Nineveh, and it has all these travel warnings about going to Nineveh. It's a harsh place, harsh people among the Syrian people. You have to go through several security checkpoints as you make your way through the armed guards and through all the gates in order to get to the city. And then right next to it, there's this beautiful pamphlet to Tarshish, which has palm trees. And it's got the words that we all want to hear on a vacation, all inclusive. And so Jonah's got this decision to make. Shall I go to the place which could be challenging or even harmful for me to go to as an outsider? Or should I go to a place where I can get a tan even with SPF 50 plus on? You know what I'm talking about? And this is maybe what he was saying in his mind. Ministry can happen anywhere. It can happen in Nineveh. It can happen in Tarshish. When I do the pro-con list, all the pros say go to Tarshish instead of going to Nineveh. Eugene Peterson, as he meditates on his own ministry life and careers, he's watched others who try to follow God, and they have a similar challenge like Jonah in this story. This is what he says about the allure of Tarshish. The exotic escapism is familiar enough. Men and women are called by God to a task and provided a vocation. We respond to the divine initiative, but we humbly request to choose the destination. In Tarshish, we can have a religious career without having to deal with God. So it's not that Jonah is inactive. He's plenty active. He decides he would rather have a different destination. And hopefully, in his mind perhaps, he's saying, maybe this is good enough. I'm still doing ministry somewhere. So we know that the sum of his decisions as he goes down to Joppa, down to the ship, down to the belly of the ship, as they're sailing on the ocean, a huge storm in Jonah chapter 1 emerges onto the ocean, and all the sailors are freaking out. They're wondering what's going on, so they're all worshiping to their different gods, trying to appease their gods, and finally they check the ship manifest, and they realize, oh, there's still a guy that we haven't asked yet, and he's all the way down in the depth of the ship, and he's taking a nap while everyone else is anxious. And they wake him up and they ask him some questions. And all Jonah says is, I'm a Hebrew and this is my fault. And so they're trying to figure out what they should do. And so Jonah gets the bright idea, hey, just throw me overboard and this will end everything. So he's there floating in the midst of the sea, in the midst of the storm. And this is where God's redemptive activity begins to take shape. When we talk about storms, this is what Eugene Peterson says back to his book. He says that storm is the environment in which we either lose our lives or are saved. Now, we may not have been in the exact position as Jonah in the middle of a storm, floating in the middle of the ocean. But there's been times in our lives, in our human experience, I would suspect, where we're in the midst of what we would call a storm, where it seems like we don't know where this thing came from or how long this is going to last, and we're challenged to the depth of who we are. And this is what Eugene Peterson says: storms are an important part of the redemptive journey because it's either going to save us or it's going to break us. So we're holding our breath as we listen to Jonah's story. What's going to happen next? And this is where in verse 17, the fish comes into the story, and answering questions about the fish is way above my pay grade. So don't waste the time. Like, don't text the question in to the number because I don't know the answer of how he could survive 3 days in the belly of a fish, okay? But nevertheless, we see an interesting shape to the reason why the fish is in the story. We might assume that the fish is further judgment upon Jonah, because I can't think of more uncomfortable accommodations than being in the belly of a fish for 3 days. I mean, imagine all that could be going on in the belly of a fish for 3 days. But the writer of Jonah and Jonah himself in the midst of his prayer look at the fish with a different light. Notice in verse 17, now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. We drop down to Jonah's prayer in the midst of Jonah chapter 2, this long prayer that he prays to God. He says, the engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down, the earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. So what does the writer of Jonah and Jonah confess about the fish? That the fish is actually grace. It's actually his salvation. Now, this is a pause for a moment. Haven't you encountered this same idea as well? That sometimes the saving act and the intervention of God is not something that we'd expect. It might be peculiar, but it's the right thing at the right moment. And so Jonah looked at his circumstances. He looked at all that had happened, all of his decisions, the storm that he was enduring, how he was nearly drowning in the ocean. He seemed like he had no hope, and then this fish swallows him up, and instead of complaining about it, and instead of being bewildered because of it, Jonah lifts his voice in prayer. In fact, some scholars suggest this is not a prayer, but this is actually a song that Jonah is singing. How ridiculous of an idea is this? He's in the belly of a fish, and at the top of his list, he says, I think it's time to strike up a tune. But this is what the early Christian voices have said, that whenever you sing, you pray twice. And Jonah was soaked in a theological and a doxological moment. He wanted to lift his voice to God because he was grateful in his heart that even after all of his rebellion, trying to run away from God, God has caught up with him. God has rescued him. He has not received what his sins are due to him, but he's received grace and mercy instead of judgment and wrath. But maybe there's something else going on about spending 3 days in the belly of a fish. Maybe it's not just that he's rescued from drowning in the ocean, but maybe this is the critical time in his spiritual formation journey where God can do some deep work within him. This is actually the first time that we get a long dialogue from Jonah. Jonah's got this interesting pattern. In chapter 1, we barely hear any words from Jonah. But in chapter 2, most of it is a song that he sings to God. When we get to chapter 3, when Jonah goes to Nineveh, he has a one-line sermon. Don't you wish you can go to Jonah's church? The sermon would last 1 minute. One line. One thing that Jonah says. But in chapter 4, we get back to something that happens in chapter 2 where Jonah and God engage in a dialogue, and we hear more from Jonah, and we can fill in some gaps in his story. Perhaps this is the point of it all. That in his reluctance, instead of standing still in Jerusalem, he decides to run away. Maybe the fish serves as a greater mercy where Jonah has to stay put. And if he stays put long enough, he can actually commune with the God he's trying to represent. He actually has space and margin in his life to pray prayers. Instead of scheming and having a long task list, getting busy in endeavors to please this God, instead of all those wonderful things, he finally has a moment to pour his heart out to God and have a time of communion with him. This is what Eugene Peterson says about the time in the fish. He says, this is the center of the story. A center located in the belly of the fish. The drowning of religious careerism is followed by resurrection into pastoral ministry. We become what we are called to be by praying. And we start by praying from the belly of the fish. God needed to drown all the plans that Jonah had about going somewhere else. And he did that in a couple different ways. He gave him a fish to put him in the right direction towards Nineveh, but he also gave Jonah a long time to sort it out in his heart and spend time praying before God. This is what Tim Keller says about the time in the belly of the fish. The way up was first all the way down. The usual place to learn the greatest secrets of God's grace is at the bottom. And this is the writing trope that the author of Jonah has. Remember, once again, Jonah goes down to Joppa. He goes down into a ship. He goes down into the ocean. He goes down into the belly of the fish. And it's there at the very bottom where he hears the secrets of God's grace. After the first service, someone who's been in recovery in our first service for nearly 30 years said that this is the message that resonated with him. He had to get to his rock bottom before he could see the way up. And I think that's common for you and for me. That as long as we have opportunities to scheme and to find a plan B or an alternate route in the GPS system of our decision making, we won't actually wake up to God's grace. It's only actually at the very bottom where Philip Yancey says, grace is like water. It pools at the lowest point possible. It's there that we finally hear those wonderful words of life, that God's grace is for us and not against us. And that's what Jonah sensed, and it caused him to pray in the midst of the belly of the fish on those 3 days. So we go further and we ask why. What could happen in the midst of this time of quiet and this time of silence? Going back to Eugene Peterson, he says that this moment of time is something that the church has been doing for some time now. This process of confinement, of confinement into one place is called ascesis. It's a Latin word which simply means a time and place of confinement and concentration. It's where all of life is unplugged and we can do the deep soul work necessary to go forward. Some of us have experienced ascesis. We were hot set on our career. We were scaling up the ranks in our organization, but for whatever reason, that next raise and promotion was out of our reach again and again. For some of us, we actually started in a different career, but through the time of prayer and through times of worship and through times of studying the scripture text, we had this urging inside that we needed to put that career behind and to start all the way over, which meant we had to go all the way back to school and to take gen eds again with kids that are half our age, who weren't appreciating their education like we were. And it was a time where it seems like everything is standing still, and it's a moment of confinement and a place of solitude. This happens for some of us. We're in a place and time of our life where we have to take care of our parents. Man, we had plans. We were setting money aside. We're going to travel and go on vacations. But because of our parents' care, we can't get further than 50 miles from Memphis. And so we're asking questions of, why is this happening to me? This wasn't the plan. Some of us are raising teenagers, and that first download of hormones has arrived in a neat package from Amazon. And we've never been there before in that parenting moment. We're asking ourselves, where did the instruction booklet go to raise them at this age. And we have to feel like we start all the way over in our training of being a parent in order to be faithful to these kids. There's 1,000 different ways that life gives us these moments of ascesis, a place of confinement where we're boxed in. But the question is, will we use that time of solitude, that time of quiet, the time of stillness for our gain? Will it be time well wasted, or will we always see it as a drag, as something that was unfortunate, and have that embittering journey instead of the deepening of the soul? Will we blame others because of our time of confinement? Will we blame our superiors, or blame the culture, or blame social media, or blame other voices out there for the hardships that we're going through? Or are we going to take a different opportunity, the opportunity that Jonah made, which is use that time wisely, to come before God and use that solitude as time well wasted. That time stands still, that we can commune with God and pour our reluctant hearts to God. Perhaps this is the grace. If we have a reluctant heart, but also a busy heart, our confinement might be the greatest gift that God gives us. Because it's in that moment of reluctance, it's in the moment of confinement that our reluctance is neutralized. And we can actually grow deeper and deeper in our faith. I want to illustrate this in a different way. There's a top 40 song out there that I've been listening to lately, and this is the words to the opening verse and the chorus of this song. Go ahead and throw those up on the screen. Now, if someone were to type these into a text message, you and I would think that this is a text message where somebody has failed with his girlfriend or something like that, and he wants to win her back because she's threatened to leave him. And so he begins to open up his text message, and he's seeking some inspiration. He says, I will fight for you. I always do until my heart is black and blue. Isn't that a sweet line? And I will stay with you. We'll make it to the other side like lovers do. That's a great rhyming scheme there. I'll reach my hands out in the dark and wait until yours to interlock. I will wait for you, I will wait for you. So if this is in a text message, you would think this is a guy's last-ditch, Hail Mary pass effort to salvage his relationship. So he sends a text message, and he keeps the app up, and he sees the dialogue thing come up with the 3 dots, and he's going, I wonder what she's going to reply, right? So these words can fulfill that occasion. But these are actually lyrics to a song by Andy Grammer that he put together for a soundtrack for the movie 5 Feet Apart. And so what I want us to do is to take these same lyrics into the music video that was made for this song. There was once a day that there was a whole channel on cable for music videos. It was called music television until it got hijacked by reality TV. And so you have to go to YouTube for this. And so I went to YouTube and captured the first minute, 30 seconds of this song. So let's go and take in that video together.
I will fight for you. I always do until my heart is black and blue. And I will stay with you. We'll make it to the other side like lovers do. I'll reach my hands out in the dark and wait for yours to until I can wait for you. I'll wait for you. I'll wait for you. I'm not giving up, no, not yet. Even when I'm down on my last.
6 feet at all times, you know the rules.
Even when they say there's nothing left, so don't give up on me. I'm not giving up, no, not me. Even when nobody else believes, I'm not going down that easily, so don't give up on me.
It's actually the theme song on the soundtrack of the film 5 Feet Apart. If you're familiar with the plot of 5 Feet Apart, there's a couple kids with cystic fibrosis, a very harsh form of it, and they can't touch one another, so they have to stand 5 feet apart even though they have feelings for one another. And so this song, it can be poured into a text message for a guy trying to win his girl back, but you pour it into a story like that, it takes on a different shape. In fact, when I was watching this on YouTube, Ezra, anytime there's a video on a screen, Ezra runs around and he wants to watch it. And I stopped it right at that point. He's like, Dad, let's see the end of that story. He almost disregarded the song because the song served as a low hum to what's going on actually in the story that's on the screen. So the same words put to music with like a story going on in the background takes a completely different shape. It's got a completely different energy. Well, I'm going to show one more video, the same minute, 35 seconds of this song, but it has a different location in a different moment, and I'll make some comments about it. Let's go ahead and take that last video.
I will fight. I will fight for you. I always do until my heart is black and blue. And I will stay. I will stay with you. We'll make it to the other side like lovers do. I'll reach my hands out in the dark and wait for yours to until I wait for you. I'll wait for you. 'Cause I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up, no, not yet. Even when I'm down on my last breath. Even when they say there's nothing left. So don't give up on me. I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up, no, not me. Even when nobody else believes. I'm not going down that easily. So don't give up on me.
So this time, Grammer is singing this song to a bunch of elementary kids at PS 22 in Staten Island, Public School 22. This is shown on YouTube. It was shown. It's been viewed 1.5 million times. It's been thumbed up by thousands of people. It's actually been thumbed down by 391 people as of this morning, which makes me think, what's wrong with your life that you would thumb down, like dislike a video like that? But here's the point. What I loved about that rendition of the song is how different it is from the music video. Did you notice the expression that washed over Andy Grammer's face at the end of that video? It's almost as if after all the stardom and after all of his popularity, he's reintroduced to the power of singing a song once again. Imagine those kids, they go to choir and Andy Grammer is in their choir class that day. They go home and say, Mom, Dad, it was the greatest day ever. They go home thinking perhaps maybe their calling in life, their vocation in life might be to be a musician like Andy Grammer, who they met not just through YouTube, but he was actually in their classroom on that day. So here's the point. This one song, the words of this song, can be poured into different environments and has different outcomes and different opportunities. When we experience confinement, when we experience difficulty in life, we can pour that energy in a couple of different ways. We can pour it towards anxiety, bewilderment, frustration, bitterness, blame shifting. We can point it in that direction, or we can point that energy to a place of prayer where we commune with our God, which we know is possible not just on a Sunday morning in a sanctuary like this, but even in the midst of a belly of a big fish, we can pour out our offering to God. Perhaps as we look at reluctance and Jonah, we can recover a good theology of prayer this morning. That prayer doesn't just happen when life is pleasant, but prayer happens on all occasions. And it has the potential to neutralize the reluctance that you and I experience in life. So may we swim alongside Jonah this morning. And instead of pointing our anxiety outwards and towards others or even inside and bring judgment and condemnation on ourselves, perhaps we can point our energies towards prayer with God, and who knows, just what might happen as we do so.